Hello and welcome to lecture number 4 on ancient Greece and Rome. If we look at this map, we can see that Greece and Rome did not exist in a vacuum. As you can see, what we've talked about before, being Mesopotamia over here with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and Egypt down here, centered along the Nile, all of these things in the bigger picture are in proximity to each other. And there was a huge amount of influence that came from each of the earlier civilizations and went into the later civilizations. Ancient Greece, here at the center of the map, was centered around the Aegean Sea. And each city had a lot of independence because the region was very mountainous and very rocky country, and there was a lot of separation and therefore a lot of political and cultural separation between each of these city states as well. And they had a lot of their own styles and a lot of their own economic and political structures. But in general, we're going to see a lot of the most basic types of structures and clothing being very similar to what we've seen both in Mesopotamia and in nearby Egypt, and even in the Americas and ancient China as well. All civilizations sort of began with the use of adobe and then adobe bricks, basic ceramic tiles, using mud essentially because it would harden into something tough enough and structural enough to build things out of. And so here we see early Greek houses, and early Roman houses could have been very similar as well. But these structures, if you had to place them in a culture that we had talked about already, without the context, you might be hard pressed to figure out that these were not Chinese, for instance, with a central courtyard and ceramic tiles. So we see a lot of the similar shapes, but this, I think, speaks to us as being a little bit more Greek. And some basic things that we're going to talk about throughout this lecture, such as columns and baluster railings and arched doorways, all are visible in this image. And that's going to be the general theme of what creates uniqueness within the Greek style. But our first keyword for the Greeks is capital. And capital with an A, not capital with an O, which would be like Washington, D.C. for us. The capital with an A is the top of something. And this is the top of a column. So on top of a column, when you have something that is larger and kind of spreads the weight out and connects it to the wall above it, that's a capital. And there were many types of capitals that we're going to talk about. And they're remarkable not because they did something different structurally, but because visually they were quite different. That might be based on where they came from or their particular time period. But to use them and to choose which ones to use would give you the ability to have a very different feeling and a very different mood, a very different reference to time period or place as well. So here are what we call the 5 classical orders, and 2 of these were developed by the Romans that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but the 3 in the middle were classic Greek orders, and they're referred to as the classical orders, but we can just refer to them as types of columns or types of column capitals. And Doric, if I can get out of the way here, is the first one on the left. And you could look at it and say it's very simple, and that is exactly how you're going to remember what Doric is. A simple, round column capital on a fluted column. And the only difference between Doric and its simpler cousin that the Romans came up with, which is Tuscan, is that Tuscan is even a little bit simpler and doesn't have flutes on the column. But there won't be a test on the difference between those because they are incredibly simple. For the Greeks, Doric, Ionic. So Ionic is the second type, and you'll recognize it always immediately by these swirly, curly cues. On each side of an Ionic capital, if it's symmetrical like this, you will see mirrored swirls, kind of like cinnamon buns. And then the only other version of that you might see those swirls is all the way over here on the far right in composite. And I'll show you another picture, but what you can see is that if Ionic is like this, then composite is like sticking out on a 45-degree angle. And of course the capital is even more decorative with these tongues and leaves and things. Sort of looks almost Egyptian a little bit. So for the Greeks, Doric, Ionic, and the third type is Corinthian. And Corinthian just means the most decorative. It came from an area called Corinth, or a city-state called Corinth, and it had many layers of leaves and palmettes and other decorative objects. We're going to look at some more of these more specifically. But if you can remember Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, those will be our Greek capital words. Let's look at them more specifically. As you can see, if I lean out of the way here, there are many, many types of columns. And let's not get too confused about that. We'll just go over these basic ones right away, and then you should be able to identify things that all of them have in common. So for a column, basically, it's fluting or no fluting, tapering towards the top, or just perpendicular. Here are the 5 orders again. You can see that for each of the 5 orders, the frieze or the entablature, the wall above the column, had a style to it as well. And I'm not going to get too specific into those differences because they can be incredibly difficult to memorize, but leave it to say that they got more complex as you move further forward in time, the Corinthian and the composite having very decorative entablatures indeed. And here's another document that is a very detailed architectural rendering of all the different styles. And this would be a great document to have if you were going to design a set for a time period or for a place in particular and wanted to give it a certain feeling. A certain sense of grandeur and scale would go along with the Corinthian order, that the Doric order was often more used for simple temples and things like that. For the Doric order, we see this a lot still today in neoclassical buildings, often in governmental buildings or banks or something like that, a simple round capital on top of a fluted column. For Ionic, we have our volutes, our cinnamon bun swirlies here, and then between those volutes, you'll see something called egg and dart trim, and that's a very weird thing, but once you recognize it for the first time, you'll start seeing it everywhere in life, on furniture, on buildings, everything. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a couple of seconds, but this is the Ionic capital. Down here you can see it also is used a lot in modern neoclassical buildings. And the Corinthian order, it can look like a lot of different things. Basically, it always sort of scoops out in an elaborate, leafy, layer cake kind of a fashion. And Corinthian is also used on very, very elaborate, sometimes very expensive church architecture or governmental buildings as well. But it speaks to the highest level of facade decor. So our next keyword is going to be cornice. And cornice is simply the top of the wall above the columns, the part that touches the roof. So if you look at this engraving here, this woodcut, you can see the columns above that, the capitals, and then up at the top, right below the roof, that's the cornice. And on modern buildings of neoclassical styling, or even many other types of stylings, there are great examples of cornices. So where the wall meets the roof and all of the decorative work that goes up there, corbels and dental work and things like that, that's all related to the cornice. So now we're on to the egg and dart motif as a specific item. Motifs, as we've talked about before, are just repeated patterns. So if you take an image or a shape and use it to create a linear or even a wallpaper pattern, that is a type of motif. Let's say we were going to put a bunch of birds and leaves together to make a wallpaper. That would be a bird and leaf motif. And egg and dart is one of, if not the oldest known motifs that comes along. And we see it earlier, but we see it also largely in the Greeks, everywhere in ancient Greece. And what it is it's a round thing, and then between each round thing, a linear thing. It's almost like binary code, zeros and ones. Some people have said that it looks like shields and spears, and some people have said that the egg and the dart represents life and death. But whatever the particular motivation, if you ever hear anything, please send me an email because I want to know. I've been trying to figure out exactly what could have inspired such a strange combination of shapes. Whatever it was, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. In this image, we can see several other motifs that were commonly used. The top motif is tongue and dart. Right below here, between the tongue and dart and the egg and dart, you see bead and reel. And Bead and reel is a common motif. Many of these motifs looked like things that might have been strung on a string, like jewelry, kind of. And I've often wondered if egg and dart is supposed to look like a section view of something else, kind of like similar to bead and reel. Down here we have palmette and lotus. Palmette coming all the way from the ancient Egyptians to influence Greek architecture, and you won't have to memorize all of these different motifs. The one that I've included here is the most important one, which is the egg and dart. But as I said before, we see it prominently on Ionic columns, here also palmette and lotus, and many, many other places throughout. We'll be seeing this well into medieval and Renaissance. All of these things are going to come back heavily throughout time, honestly, up until the modern industrial time period. And so here's some more details of the egg and dart. It can come in many different shapes. The bottom one here looks quite like a spear tip or an arrow or a dart. And then the top one here being a little bit more stylized, like an arrow pointing you on a sign or something. But they can be quite decorative, and there are many, many different variations. In fact, almost every one will be a little different than another one. These volutes on this Ionic column being quite unique for the thinness of their ribbing. And it can even be stacked. So the egg and dart here is in sort of a vertically repeating pattern. Just bear in mind that even though I will try to give you as much information as I think is valuable, the only things that you'll have to memorize and know are these words that appear on the screen and that you can find in the vocabulary documents. So the last one was just egg and dart, and this one is the Greek key. And the Greek key is also called a meander. So if you have a motif that's made out of a single line and it just goes and goes and goes and goes, kind of like Celtic knotwork or something like that, the Greek key or the Greek meander took on many different shapes, but you'll recognize it immediately by this sort of geometric continuous line. And some of it was quite beautiful, and you can find it with leaf work, or you can find it next to egg and dart. You can find it in relation to a lot of their low relief sculpture, but it's just called Greek key or Greek meander. There are many different styles, and like I said, you can find it on furniture, on interior decor. Here we see some lovely motifs around a fireplace. There are infinite variations of Greek key, and they could have been used on fabric and clothing just as much as on decor. Our next keyword is frieze. So frieze is a section of the wall above the columns, but it's also the sculpture that would be put on that wall. And I think basically that they got to this point where they're post and lintel construction, right? So we have two posts, and those are the columns, and then we put a big piece overhead, and that's a strong beam that will hold up the rest of your building. After a while, they just thought, all right, well, we've decorated under it, we've got the capitals, we've decorated over it, we've got the cornice, we got this big blank wall area. What are we going to do? And they started putting sculptures, and a lot of these were about stories about their history or their political events or battles. So the frieze is a section of wall with sculpture on it, often low relief figures from important stories. Interestingly enough, these sculptures and these friezes are one of the key ways that we know about their clothing and hairdress and jewelry of the time. But a frieze could also be a decorative motif of natural ornament. And on this sort of neoclassical, sort of Art Deco-y structure, you can see that they are just sort of iconic and almost fantastic, like a winged horse and other things like that. So it could be stories about gods, they could be stories about heroes. But that also is where you see the frieze section of the wall, above the columns, above the architrave there, but below the cornice where it would interact with the roof. Here's a classical frieze that's been seen some damage and then been put back together. Here's a very old frieze that's seen a lot of weathering. Our next keyword is the pediment. And this is a neoclassical structure. Obviously, it's not ancient Greek, but I've chosen this picture because it shows you only the pediment, the triangular bit where two parts of a sloping roof meet the wall above the columns, that triangle is the pediment. And that's what we're talking about when we say pediment. It's not anything else. However, it will often be decorated with sculpture, low relief sculpture like the frieze sculptures, or even high relief sculptures. We're going to see that here in a second. But the triangular face at the end of a wall or the end of a building, that's what the pediment is. And we're going to see that kind of shape used again over doorways and arches, and it comes up many, many more times in the future in neoclassical architecture. So here we see a pediment decor, and this is very high relief sculpture of Greek figures on the pediment. And so what we can see here is that the carving goes all the way behind the figures. And if you remember from Mesopotamian, that's what makes it high relief. And also you can see here there are quite a few motifs that are around these figures. Here's a classical pediment with no sculptures or figures, but you can see that it's seen a lot of weather and it's still standing. Very interesting. Here's another classical pediment with looks like a story of Athena and a battle. Very cool. We can see some looks like palmetto and lotus motif just above them, below the acroterion up there. And here's another pediment. I just wanted you guys to see all the different variations of the way that these things could be put together to form very unique buildings. Here's another like modern neoclassical pediment. Just for curiosity's sake, when you see these little square blocks, they're called dentil, D-E-N-T-I-L. And that's not one of our keywords, but I think it's very interesting. And it's easy to remember because they look kind of like teeth, and it sounds like dental. But it's not the same word. But anytime you see them on neoclassical buildings, and they appear very frequently, you can see them here in this picture, they're dental blocks. Just an interesting decorative feature. Our next keyword is the Acropolis. And the Acropolis was a big hilltop that was right in the center of Athens, that is still right in the center of Athens. But it was a major city center for Athens. There were several really important temples and buildings on the Acropolis. Yeah, and still today it contains the ruins of the Parthenon and the Erechtheion and things like that. So today the Acropolis looks like this, and it's incredibly beautiful to be there. You can see Athens stretched out, modern Athens stretched out all around the Acropolis. But these temples and this area, of course, is a national monument of Greece, the current country. But during this time in the Greek Empire, of course, it was an incredibly important city center, and the temples on it were some of the largest and finest temples in Greek culture. Here's another view of the Acropolis with the Parthenon. And here's another artist's depiction of it during the time period. And so the Parthenon, our next keyword, was the major temple that was on the Acropolis. The most important surviving Greek building today, a huge temple to Athena, and it was also the height of Doric construction. So what we can see here is Doric column capitals, very simple, round, but very large columns, fluted, tapering columns. We can see that above the columns there's the entablature or the wall, and we can see the shape of the pediment, although much of it has been in fact lost. But what we can see here is that even though this is some of the largest and finest architecture that we've seen up until this period of history, is that the ancient Greeks were still using post and lintel construction. They were still putting two vertical uprights and putting something across the top. There's no more mathematical or physics innovation here than there was with Stonehenge. But what they have done is they have perfected the geometry of spacing and size. All of their shapes and their blocks are of similar or exactly the same dimensions. All of their columns are exactly the same. So there was a perfection of methodology and industry in their creation, and an incredibly fine artistry and the realism of their sculpture and things like that. But ancient Greece we can see as the zenith of post and lintel construction, because while it was incredibly complex, they never, very seldom and very late did they get into what comes next beyond post and lintel construction, which is a huge revolution in architecture that we're going to talk about with the Romans. So here's an image from a video game about ancient Greece, and it's a wonderful depiction of what they feel that the Parthenon may have looked like at the time. And so all of the paint and all of the fabric decoration that would have adorned it at the time, it's quite lovely to see that when you compare it to how 2,000 or 3,000 years, 2,000 years have really weathered the Parthenon. Again, from a video game, a depiction of the inside of the Parthenon. But we know very, very well what was inside the Parthenon because of writings that told of visiting it. Imagine visiting the largest and most beautiful temple in the world. In that time period, so many people wrote about their experiences there, and those accounts give us information about what the inside looked like. And so there are many artist depictions. In fact, someone has built a full replica of the Parthenon in Nashville. If you want to go check it out, this beautiful statue of Athena in gold and ivory is an exact replica, as far as anyone knows, of what the statue actually looked like. And I believe that's actually gold, although I doubt it's actually ivory. But here are some more artist depictions of the inside. And so we see columns and layers of columns. And as we remember, one of the challenges with post and lintel construction is that you need to have a lot of columns because you can't span a very wide distance. You can't have a very big room without any columns inside it, because your lintel, of course, is just a stick horizontal, and eventually enough weight on that will make it brittle and break. And stone, while very hard and strong, is typically very brittle. Here are some figures from the pediment decor of the Parthenon that were saved, and you can see they're in kind of a triangular shape, and that was the shape that they were in when they were on the pediment of the Parthenon. This is from a nearby temple called the Erechtheum, and it was a building that was used primarily by the priestesses and acolytes of Athena. So it was even more sacred and even more private. But alone in Greek architecture, as far as I am aware, do we have an example of sculptural figures being used as the columns. And you can see that these are almost Doric capitals that are on their heads, but you can see also that there is egg and dart on those Doric capitals. Very beautiful sculptural work here. Here's another picture of the Erechtheon, and this is another key area where we get a great example of realistic clothing from the time period. So the Theater of Dionysus, it was an ancient outdoor theater, and it's on the hillside of the Acropolis, and it was huge. It could seat up to 17,000. And this is very important for us as theater practitioners because we want to be aware of the shapes of theater spaces. And I'm sure that you've probably studied this either in high school or in an intro to theater class. But as we're learning about this architecture, I want you to be aware of their theatrical structures as well. What we see here, of course, is the seating, and the tiled area is the orchestra, not where music was necessarily performed, but where a lot of performance in general happened. And then up in the back, what we would call the upstage area, we see the skene, which is the back wall. And that would have been there for all performances, of course, because it's made out of stone. But you can also see that from many seats, and perhaps through the skene, you could see a distant vista of the landscape beyond. And this was very, very common in both Greek and Roman theaters. Here's another view of the Theater of Dionysus. Now we're going to move on to the Roman Empire. And there's one thing that you need to know primarily that's going to set Rome apart, and it's also going to set the stage for all of architectural history to come. And that is that the Romans perfected concrete for the first time. There were cements and other like mortars that people used to hold things together before. But for the first time, the Romans perfected a recipe for cement that would allow them to make concrete the way that we think of it today. And if you've never looked at it or thought about it, cement that we perceive of it today Um, it's basically a mixture of liquid ingredients with water, so rocks and minerals that have a chemical reaction when they're mixed with water and they're mixed together. That over time they harden into essentially stone. And so the incredible revolution of concrete is that you can make any shape you want, as large as you want, and make it as hard as rock. So that instead of having lintels that were the shape of the natural rocks you had found or stones that you had carved out, you could make structures that were entirely of your own design. So you could decide every aspect of what your pieces would be when you make something. Um, and so, what's valuable about that is that the Romans were able to create structures that were larger and more complex and had a greater interior area than ever before. So what we see here, this is a photo from Trajan's market. And what we see overhead, this gray color, is gray because it's concrete. And also everything else that we see is bricks. The concrete enabled the Romans to use brickwork and to use much smaller pieces in their construction than anyone ever could before. Because if you use small pieces without really strong concrete or mortar, they would eventually fall apart or fall out or separate from each other. But with concrete, everything that the Romans built stayed for hundreds of years, if not for thousands, because much of what we have from the Romans today is still in excellent condition. Here's a picture of the Colosseum, and while I'm sure all of you know what the Colosseum is, have you ever noticed or known that it is made entirely out of bricks and concrete, not giant stones like we think of everything from ancient civilizations being made? If you look here, you can see a lot of gray and red down here on the bottom right. That's concrete. And it's really incredible because they never would have been able to make such a massive structure out of only massive stones, if that makes any sense. Here's a concrete and stone wall that is also of Roman construction, and it is still in excellent condition today. So if you look at this arch here, if you look at the top of the arch, you can see that it's made out of very thin bricks. And without really strong mortar, or without mortar at all, this arch probably would have held up. But after a couple of decades, after a few earthquakes, these thin bricks would have started shattering and falling apart. And instead, what you can see is that many of them are broken, and yet they haven't moved at all. This arch shape is still exactly perfect after thousands of years. And that's what the concrete revolution is really all about. Here again, we can see a very large Roman structure made primarily out of concrete and bricks. And they would face things in bricks because bricks look better. But in both of these images, you can see the interior section of a wall where they have filled it in with rocks and concrete. And you put rock or gravel into concrete, it's called aggregate. It holds it together and it makes it even stronger. If you used only cement, you would basically just have like a dried biscuit version of a rock that would just crack. But by using filler material inside the cement, they all hold together and make something that is incredibly, incredibly strong. And so our greatest example of concrete use is the Pantheon. We just talked a moment ago about the Parthenon, and that is the ancient Greek temple, the greatest post and lintel building. But for the ancient Romans, who came hundreds or up to 1,000 years later, the Pantheon is their greatest structure, and I am sorry that the words are so similar. But the Pantheon is very, very different than the Parthenon. And while the front of it does in fact look a lot like the Parthenon, with a pediment, with some dental work and some motifs, including egg and dart, with some lovely Corinthian columns, the thing that makes the Pantheon different is the inside, what's called the rotunda. And the inside of the Pantheon is a 43-meter dome that is entirely made out of concrete. It's not reinforced with rebar and steel the way we would pour concrete today. In fact, the Pantheon today, which you can see these are tourists, is still in excellent condition, and it is still the world's largest entirely concrete dome, which is just incredible. You can see here that the dome is a perfect circle that goes up, but what you can't see is that the walls at the bottom are over 21 feet thick, and at the top, near the hole in the top called the oculus, they're about 3 feet thick. Here is the Pantheon from the outside. So it's seen a lot of weathering, but considering that it is over 2,000 years old, it is in excellent condition. And that, again, is the miracle of concrete and brick construction. Here's a cutaway, an ancient, not ancient, but a really old woodcut engraving of an artist's perception of the architectural structure of the Pantheon. This was never a giant hole in the Pantheon. But you can see here the way that the wall steps and thins as it gets higher up on the dome of the Pantheon. And you can see the oculus here. The hole in the top actually reduces weight and increases strength because of that. So our next keyword is the arch, and I'm sure you've all heard of and thought about this before, and you know what it is. But let's stop and think for a second about the importance of the arch. Because while civilizations had the arch before, so this is the alternative to post and lintel construction. While you see the arch in other civilizations earlier, you won't see it as much, and it's because that concrete made it possible for the arch to be incredibly strong and to last incredibly long. And so this is just a children's toy, this photo that we have here, of wooden blocks. And if you can imagine putting these blocks together, they would love to fall down. But these arch blocks, the keystone block here and the voussoirs that we're going to talk about in a second, the weight of the wall above it is pushing down on the keystone. And that, in turn, is pushing against the voussoirs next to it. And so to perfect the arch allowed the Romans and all of us, everyone in the world subsequently, to be able to have much more intricate structures with much larger interior space, with fewer columns. And it just led to everything that would follow it. And if you put several arches in a row, then what you have is an arcade. And an arcade is a structure that allows you to create a series of openings, a series of windows or doorways, to have a wall supported above with many openings into it. This is quite different than, let's say, the Parthenon, where you had columns in a row that were all supported by lintels going across. If you have a row of columns, that's called a colonnade, but an arcade in architecture is a series of arches in a row. And arcade construction led to, like I said, ubiquitous use throughout the rest of history. In this image, you can see specifically the keystone in the middle, and even though these stones have all been carved with a linear decor, you can see the joints where each of these voussoirs is an individual piece of stone that's been carved out and is holding all the weight above it. Here's a picture of the Colosseum, and you can see that, again, it's largely concrete and bricks, but its exterior structure is simply a series of arcades in a giant oval shape. So the arcade is a tool that you can use to make many other things. Here's another arcade, and so brick and concrete allowed you to make things that were incredibly delicate. This, for the Greeks, would have been unheard of with the delicacy of the structure that we see here. And again, another fine example of the arcade. So another major use of the arcade structure was for the aqueduct. A Roman aqueduct is an arcade-based structure to move water great distances using gently sloping bridge work, and some were as long as 82 miles. So the Romans had a huge empire, and they invented civilization for themselves in a vast wilderness, right, over thousands of years or hundreds of years. And they wanted to be able to get water to their cities, even if it was really far away. They wanted to be able to build where they wanted to build and not have to build near water. And today, city planners still deal with these same issues, but we have much more modern materials. But for the Romans, they would build huge aqueducts, miles and miles in length, to carry water from one place to another. And many of these still stand today because of the incredible engineering and material usage of the Romans. And so what it was they would have a reservoir, a lake, or some sort of water source, and they would be able to move the water to a city or wherever they wanted, and they would keep it as high as possible for as long as possible. So here you can see this city is above this water, or is below this water, and they would be able to just have it pour downhill toward the city. But instead, they've both covered this valley and they've kept the water as high as possible and moved it to the city. And what's valuable in that is that if you keep the water as high as possible, then when it gets to the city, you can use gravity to pipe it into your buildings. And so the Romans, in many areas and in many cities, had running water for at least a fountain that people could access, or interior running water in homes and villas, and for richer people and for important buildings. And like I said, many of these aqueducts are still major features of cities throughout Southern Europe today. Here's a water channel on top of the aqueduct. And so an aqueduct might have multiple water channels, but this one on top of this aqueduct, it just became a trough where water would run continuously in a direction, simply because the architecture was slightly sloped towards one direction. So our next keyword is a vault. And a vault is very simple. If you take an arch and you continue it, you extend it or extrude it out, you have a vault. And this simple rounded vault is called a barrel vault. In fact, if you cut the rounded part off and continued it all the way around, it would look kind of like a barrel. And that's why it's called a barrel vault. And the barrel vault was used to create very large rooms for the first time, the largest rooms, because you could extrude the arch into a barrel vault. And so you can have quite large architecture that would be unheard of. You could never have post and lintel to span what here is probably 60 to 80 to 100 feet. If you have two barrel vaults come together at 90-degree angles, what you're going to have is called a groin vault. Remember, the key word here is just vault, but I'm going to tell you more about specific vaults, but just refer to vault as this concept in general. But a groin vault is two perpendicular barrel vaults coming together. And with groin vaults, you can now have very large spaces indeed. This room with its very tiny, delicate columns is possible because of the way that the keystone sheds weight and pressure down the voussoirs, down the arch, to the springers and impost blocks, and to the capital and to the column. And to be able to have a large interior space like this that is incredibly sturdy, but also incredibly bright, because you can have large windows, you can have large openings. This was a huge innovation in architecture for the first time. Previous, very early large interiors that we saw were often dark, they often leaked. And with post and lintel construction, we would have seen much larger, blockier columns. And so here you can see ribbed vaulting, so like the sticky outy bits that are protruding into the room and they have a decorative rounded shape to them. Those are ribs that we're going to be talking about with Gothic and a little bit later. But this is still yet a groin vault where perpendicular barrel vaults are coming together. Here's a simplified version or a view of the way that these vaulted arches would come together. And of course, the final type of vault that we're going to talk about is a dome. And the largest and maybe the only or one of the few remaining domes is the Pantheon. But think about the dome as an arch that you have rotated in 360 degrees about its center point, so that you have a perfectly round arch shape all the way around. But nonetheless, the large stones at the top are shedding weight down and around, just like in the classic simple arch. And so the dome became a key feature in much later architecture that we'll, again, continue to talk about throughout time. Funnily enough, this particular dome of the Pantheon, a 43-meter sphere, would fit exactly within the Pantheon. And that just shows the precision of the geometry that they were using at the time. Cool, the Colosseum. So the Colosseum was a massive amphitheater, This is a modern picture of not the Colosseum, but it is it's an arena that is in Spain where they still do performances and reenactments that it is almost as large as the Colosseum. So it's 80 to 90% the size of the Colosseum. But I want to show you this picture to give you a sense of the scale and just the vast scale of performances and entertainment that would go on. Both in Rome, where the Colosseum was, and then throughout the empire. So this amphitheater in Spain was built far from the center of the Roman Empire, but they had massive architecture that was across thousands and thousands of miles. And in the Colosseum, of course, there were gladiator fights and combat to the death and animal fights and lots of terrible, terrible things that were considered acceptable forms of entertainment. Both sacrificing of slaves and war captives and Christians to animals and other terrible things. But the scale of this depiction in this painting is a bit large. It's a bit large for what the Colosseum really was. But it sort of is an artist's depiction of the grandeur of the place. The Colosseum today is, of course, in ruins, but still exists. Here you can see in the distance, the orange is a new construction, and that is just where tourists can stand, but it is where the floor would have been. Underneath the floor of the whole Colosseum, there was this structure where there were slave quarters and preparation rooms and animal holding pens and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. And I have found out recently that they have plans to build a new floor in the Colosseum and new seating. And this was recently decided that they're going to have performances of different kinds in the Colosseum again. I don't know if they'll be having animal fights or fights to the death, probably not, but it'll be exciting to see what they're going to do. But this picture of the outside of the Colosseum shows its elliptical arcade structure. And we'll be seeing this picture again when we talk more about clothing at the end. Another amazing thing about the Colosseum is that so precise was the stonework and so strong was the concrete that they could fill it up with water and have naval battles inside the Colosseum, which was absolutely maybe one of the coolest things of all time. And they would have gladiators and slaves fight to the death on ships in a Colosseum full of water. What you see in the background here is not the Colosseum, it's just another arena that they filled with water. But this was a common theme in Roman entertainment, that people of, for their time, the highest civilization, also put on some of the most horrific and terrible forms of entertainment. Here's another picture of some of the naval battles that went on. Our next keyword is mosaic, and a mosaic is an image or a pattern made out of tiny squares or pieces of stone or glass. And this is some of the most beautiful art that still exists. And if you think about it, it's because it doesn't fade like paint. It doesn't deteriorate unless it is physically acted upon. And so a huge portion of what we know about their clothing, their everyday goods, their artistic abilities comes from mosaics, which we have found over time and tell us just so much. You can see that there's a sense of perspective here. Unlike ancient Egyptians, you can see that the table recedes into the distance, and so this person is sitting behind it. And so we still find Roman mosaics all the time, almost monthly, because new excavations turn up something that the Romans had built that we didn't know about before. Their empire was so incredibly vast. And every one of them is, the architecture is stopped at that point, and we go in and turn it into a site so that we can dig it out and find out all the information that's possible about their art, about what the images depict. On the left here, we have a column from Pompeii that has a simple motif mosaic on it. And on the right, here is a floor mosaic that was a very large floor in a simple geometric pattern. And you can see that it's wavy, and that's because the ground has changed over time, but the mosaic has just kind of waved with it like frozen glass, kind of. Here's a Poseidon mosaic in green and black and gold. And here's a very famous centaur mosaic. So not just realism, but also lots of fables and legends and from Greek mythos would they depict in all of these mosaics. Here is a Olympics mosaic. And here's another view of that wavy floor mosaic. It's quite lovely. Here's some animals. So coming towards the end of the Roman lecture here, we're going to talk about a few individual building types. So the domus was just a house that middle to upper class Romans would live in, spacious and open with a central area for the family. These smaller buildings that we saw at the very beginning of this lecture would be referred to as a domus, but they could be of many different sizes based on economic status and class. So inside the domus, you would often have a large central room. That was the main room. It would often have a pool or fountain inside of it. And then the rest of the building would be centered around a courtyard, much like we saw with ancient Chinese architecture. In fact, this is not at all that different from what we would see from that civilization. And there are many types of domuses, many different individual structures, but often you would see sloping ceilings or sloping roofs down to a sky well. Insulae. Insulae were giant apartment buildings where the very poorest people who lived inside lived in cities. And so they were often cramped and full of families, and the conditions were often terrible. In fact, they look a lot like many later industrial area brick buildings. Such was the huge leap forward in concrete technology that the Romans created. But these insulae often did not have running water. They may have been pumped into the lower apartments, but they had to go down and get them from the upper floors. A lot of these insulae were written about in history as terrible places to live, that as the populations of cities grew and grew, these became like squalid rentals that were terrible places to live. But a large portion, millions of Roman citizens, lived in insulae. Here you can see a cutaway of the close quarters of civilization in an insulae. And though a lot of them, they did have interior sky wells and courtyards, they were too small for the hundreds of people who might live in one insulae. And on the opposite end of the economic spectrum, we have a villa, which could have been just for one or owned by one senator or very wealthy person and his family. And the villas were massive mansions that followed the same concepts of symmetry, of an open courtyard, of sloped roofing, but based on the wealth of the person, could be vast with dozens or hundreds of servants and interior gardening that we see here in this one. And they became almost like little cities in and of themselves because they would be centered on farmland where everything that they needed would have been grown. But the villas were just the height of individual residential architecture. So now we're going to talk very briefly about the clothing from both of these civilizations. And we're going to talk briefly about it because there are a lot of similarities to what we have seen in other civilizations. Just a little bit of individual styling for these two places. So for both Greece and Rome, and our other civilizations as well, a simple tunic was the main garment that you would see ubiquitously across all of civilization. Even if you were wearing something more complex, there was a high chance that you were wearing a tunic underneath it. And this type of garment spans throughout history. Even today, you can see variations on this type of garment. It's the most simple shape that can cover the body with allowing arms to get out through sleeves. And our first Greek costume word or clothing word is the chiton. And the chiton was a simple tunic, pleated, and it was often pinned instead of being sewn, but there would be a belt or a sash at the middle that would allow them to do some blousing. So they could pull their chiton up a bit and have it blouse over the belt. And that's a very common shape in ancient Greek clothing. Here we can see the chiton on various statues. Whereas the other major Greek word that we're going to have is peplos. And the peplos was a loose dress bloused over a belt that was many layered and pleated. So it's not too different from the chiton, but it can be seen as much more in depth, and it started with a much larger piece of fabric, and so the blousing was more elaborate, and the pleating was more elaborate as well. Here on the Erechtheum, we can see that they were wearing quite elaborate pleated peplos. But all of this is just to say that there was a large variety of fabric draping and blousing and wrapping that is not entirely different from what we've seen in other civilizations. So here we can see a tunic layer underneath a series of other layered garments for different purposes, different jobs, different class roles. Our first of two Roman clothing words is going to be the toga. And the toga was often made of linen. It was a very large piece of fabric that would have been elaborately wrapped around someone who was already wearing a tunic. And the toga was often just a formal wear. Here we see a filmic depiction of a Roman senator wearing a toga in the Senate. And these were difficult to wear, unwieldy a bit because of their size. If you look at this statue and the amount of fabric this guy has on, linen is a light fabric, but it is also a little bit stiff, and so these would have been loose fitting, but also not totally easy to wear around. But they would be seen ubiquitously amongst the higher class, especially in formal events. And colors of stripes and patterns would indicate status or jobs. Like the Roman senators here, we see all have the red stripes that they're wearing. And from this depiction here, you can see different angles of the same thing. So on the left of the photograph, you can see is it Mark Antony? He's wearing a tunic, and then over top of it, he has his toga. On the left, you can see how specifically, I think that may actually be a statue of Mark Antony, with a tunic underneath and then a toga on top of it. And our other Roman word is the stola. And the stola was an ankle-length pleated dress fashioned at the shoulders, and it could also have long sleeves. And this is something that they could wear with other layers as well. And so you'll see this crop up in Roman depictions in a variety of different shapes and styles and colors, but in general, the stola was more of a dress and harkens back to the Greek peplos, although there was not the obsession with the elaborate blousing that we saw with the peplos. So here's some more. Kind of like the toga, the amount of fabric that could be layered and pleated could be quite a lot. But this, for us, we start to see more of a modern figure here, more of a large layered dress. In general, you would see throughout the classes ubiquitous use of the tunic, and for these people here within a large amphitheater, you can see a variety of colors and shapes and textures, but leaning more towards the simple for the everyday person and task. Although there were a variety of other formal garments and layers for different weather and things like that we see cropping up in mosaics, a lot of it is starting to take a simple shape that we would recognize more today. Of course, they had a variety of clothing for athletic activity. Again, this is from, I think, some of the Olympic mosaics that were found. And looking through all of this, you can see that every garment is really unique to the individual to a certain degree. So those are our keywords for ancient Greece and Rome. It was a whirlwind tour, and I apologize for the pacing of it, but this will be the last lecture that covers such a large amount of time. We'll be moving forward now into fewer and simpler list of vocabulary and getting more specifically into the why and the how and the who of what happened. And it becomes very, very interesting to look at all that and to see how things interacted and how they were influenced by what came before them. So as always, please feel free to email me with any questions or issues, and I'll be sending out my weekly update email soon. Until then, I look forward to talking with you again. Thank you very much.